Hello, welcome to another Coffee and HEMA with me, Jeremy Kiva, where I try and make a point about HEMA and the time it takes to make a coffee. No actual coffee today. I have the day off, so I thought I'd bash out a few of these. I do change my clothes. You'll be seeing these all spaced out. I promise you they're on the same day. I'm not just wearing the same clothes for God knows how many days in a row. I wanted to do some of the request videos that have come through. I didn't notice these because it's in an email I don't use very often that they come through to, and I've got a bunch of requests that I want to bash out some responses to. So thank you people for submitting them. And if you have your own kind of topic you want me to cover, the link to the request form is in the comments, in the description rather, not the comments. So this first one is from a person who would rather not be named. And they ask me, and I'll read out the question, it says, could you talk about the tournament scene in nations and places other than the countries with an established scene? For example, South America, the Middle East, and Asia. The short answer is no, or I can, but you've got to take my answer with a pinch of salt, because of course, most of my tournament experience is in the countries with an established tournament scene. Just to give a flavour, obviously the most tournaments that I've done are in the UK, where I am a very active member, running and competing in tournaments. I've competed in pretty much all of the major UK tournaments except for Kings of the North, I think, as well as running a big proportion of the tournaments here. I've competed in all of the Scandinavian countries. I have tell a lie, I haven't competed in Denmark, but I've competed in Norway, I've competed in Sweden, Finland, done the Netherlands, I've done France, I've done Italy, not the German countries because they don't kind of branch out so much. I'm sure I'm missing something in Europe, but I can't think of what. I've competed in the USA, and I've competed in Belarus and Minsk, the European Games tournament that was done there. Most of that is Europe. Only once have I competed outside of Europe in the US, which was fun. So you've got to bear in mind that, of course, if I'm going to travel for something, I expect there to be something worth traveling for. So I'm going for places where there was some kind of established scene, some tournament which I'm not getting from the scene in the UK. But having said all that, right, I still have I hope it's interesting to say about these countries that I've never been to. There's a few that I know a little bit about the HEMA scene from friends of friends or people who've come over here. And before I get into the specifics of the countries I happen to know about, which is quite a random selection, just to be clear, I want to touch upon what it is to have a national scene in the first place. What does that actually mean? Because it's quite an interesting thing to think about, actually, anyway. And the US is probably the easiest way of thinking about this distinction, but let's just take away from the US for now, okay? So what we say, we have like national scenes or renowned national scenes. The thing you've got to bear in mind is that for the most part, a national scene is one or a handful of people driving for a particular outcome or culture. And that's pretty much true across the board. It's still true of the UK to a large extent, right? That most of the tournaments in the UK spawn from the same set of people who started the Wessex League and started a few other things as well, Albion Cup, and Wessex League and Albion Cup make up 2/3 of the tournaments in the UK still. Certainly ones that are regularly running. And the same is true of other countries. You see this actually quite a lot, sort of, because why post-pandemic a lot of scenes have sort of dried up, is that it's only actually a handful of people, and maybe then the people who take on from them, which in my case is Wessex League, I took on from the original organisers, running with it, that are driving this national scene still. So actually what you see, while they get established and they get recognised, for the most part, what you're actually seeing is the opinions and the structures put in place by a relatively small group of people, even in these established scenes. And as I say, you see this in the US because the US does not have a national scene. The US has a collection of local scenes that are quite different from each other because the distances in the US are so much faster than the UK. When we run a Wessex League, we are drawing people from Alcon was the UK, and as well places outside of the UK that are close by, like Netherlands, Ireland. People come down from Scotland, people come from Wales to what is essentially a local territory. Wessex is south of the UK. Finally, we go up to as far as Cardiff, which is kind of mid-ish. But still, it's coming through that way. In the US, when I was in the US for this tournament, I was in Philly for fencing, but not tournaments, and I drove up to Boston. That drive is my entire country. Those are a relatively local scene, but you compare Philadelphia to SoCal, Southern California tournaments, they're not in the same bucket. There's different individuals driving that. They have different views of what fencing is. They have different presentation of culture. So when you go outside of these countries that have a recognized scene, this phenomena is even more strong. That what you get is a couple of people being fairly influential, either directly or indirectly, because they've inspired other people to do similar kinds of stuff. Now, the less well-known countries that I happen to know something about, I would say, are Singapore, China, and South Africa. And this is entirely because of either friends of friends or people have come over from those scenes to London, because London's quite an international city, and I've had some kind of interaction with them. So I don't want to generalize, because these are all very different, again, because they're driven by a small selection of people. So South Africa does not really have a tournament scene to speak of. The HEMA clubs in South Africa have no appetite for tournament, as far as I'm aware. Maybe there are some now, but certainly the major ones have no appetite for tournament. They're not engaged in tournaments in any way, shape, or form, or anything that's really kind of brushing on a tournament. So there's no tournament scene to speak of. They tend to do relatively low kit stuff, partly because the weather kind of promotes that. Although Australia has an established tournament scene, and they've got even worse weather issues, so that's not really a fair excuse. But yeah, there is no real tournament scene in South Africa. China, I know, has a tournament scene. I'm not really involved with the tournaments at all. I know we have lots of Chinese students who come over, as in they are university students people who come over from China, who have done HEMA in China, and they tend to interact with us through Waterloo Sparring Group, which is a sparring group in London, Waterloo, that has a lot of clubs kind of collaborate there and spar with each other. The Chinese scene is pretty much, I don't really like the sport versus martial art aspect, but the sport aspect is turned up to 11. The history aspect is dialed down to -1. Many people who come over have never looked at, and we've interacted with, have never interacted with the source, either directly or indirectly through their instructor. They tend to be focusing on sparring, on being fast. They have limited technical repertoires as a result. And from what I've seen of tournament footage in China, that seems to apply to the tournaments as much as the sparring. China's a big place, so apologies if I just lambasted some Chinese person your club is not that. I have limited interaction, so take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt. And Singapore, relatively small place with 2 or 3 clubs, in Singapore. Singapore, I was asked about Asia, right? These are both in Asia, but I don't think there's any interaction, particularly with the Chinese and Singapore scene, any more than there is, with Singapore and here. I happen to have some friends in Singapore, and I know that there is a nascent tournament scene, but again, it's largely driven by one club. Bastion HEMA, I think, is the name of the club. I might get that slightly wrong, and I believe the tournament's called Bashfest. Again, I could have got that wrong. Apologies if I'm misrepresenting anything. And it seems to be a nice, well-run, small local tournament with a good focus on not just kind of open longsword, but some other weapons. I know that this year they have their first women's tournament, which seems to have quite a few people entered into it, which is nice to see. But once again, it's one club promoting these things. And the Singapore scene is relatively small. There are only a couple of clubs there, so it's not going to have some kind of massive tournament scene. Outside of that, I know that there was an Australian scene and a New Zealand scene, the details of which I really am afraid I don't know. I know that there are some excellent fencers in Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand, I think, has much less of a tournament scene than Australia. I know a lot of New Zealand competitors will go over to Australia for their tournament scene, but Australia was another country kind of separated by big distances, and what you have is, again, kind of local scenes to do that. So I'm afraid this was fairly light on detail because I've given you as much detail as I have. As I say, everything I know is friends of friends, really, or people who I've interacted with in London who told me about their local scene. I have no personal direct experience of these scenes. I'd love to. South America is the other one I was asked about. I know that there is some tournaments in Chile and Argentina, and in Latin America, wider, Mexico has a couple international and national tournaments. What they look like, don't know. I've not been. I would like to go to the Mexican ones, especially at some point, but it never coincides with my time in Mexico, sadly. So, maybe one day. But to wrap up, it is very difficult to talk about national scenes for the places that are less well known for their tournament scenes, because there is no national scene. It is a scene created by a couple of individuals. And as you can see, if I don't have my coffee forcing me to shut up, I will ramble on for much longer. So apologies for the longer video. Hopefully it was informative.